On a freezing winter night, an officer discovers twin newborns abandoned in a dumpster, fragile, helpless, and clinging to life. He vows to protect them, naming them Hope and Faith, and ensures they're placed in a loving home. But tragedy strikes, and the officer makes a life-changing decision to raise them himself, sacrificing everything to give them a future. 25 years later, his phone rings. It's a call that will shake his world to its core. Who's on the other end? And what secret from the past is about to change their lives forever? Don't miss this gripping tale of love, resilience, and the shocking twists that bind us all. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The winter wind howled through the empty streets as Officer Thomas Blake guided his patrol car through the familiar routes of his small Midwestern town. At 36, he'd grown accustomed to the quiet nights, but something about this evening's bitter cold made the silence feel heavier than usual. The dashboard clock showed 11:42 p.m., and the temperature gauge registered a harsh 12 degrees. Ice crystals had started forming at the edges of his windshield, creating delicate patterns that caught the glow of passing streetlights. Thomas adjusted the heat in his squad car, his gloved hands gripping the steering wheel as he turned down another deserted alley. The beam of his headlights caught the swirling snowflakes, creating ghostly patterns against the brick walls. He'd done this route hundreds of times before, but tonight felt different. There was an unsettling stillness in the air that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. That's when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it over the rumble of his engine. Thomas slowed the car, tilting his head to listen more carefully. There it was again, a muffled cry that seemed to pierce the winter air, making his heart skip a beat. "Dispatch, this is Officer Blake," he spoke into his radio, his voice steady despite the growing unease in his chest. "I'm checking out a possible disturbance near Mason and 4th. After receiving confirmation, he stepped out of his warm car into the biting cold, the wind immediately cutting through his uniform. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness as Thomas followed the sound, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. The crying grew slightly louder as he approached a rusty dumpster pressed against the building's wall. His heart began to race as he recognized the distinct wail of an infant. The sound echoed off the brick walls, making it somehow more desperate and urgent. With trembling hands, Thomas lifted the heavy metal lid. What he saw made his blood run cold. Two tiny babies, barely visible beneath thin, tattered blankets, lay huddled together. Their small faces were red from crying and cold, their movements weak but desperate. Frost had begun to form on the edges of their makeshift swaddling. "Dear God," he whispered, immediately shrugging off his heavy police jacket. "Dispatch. I need immediate medical assistance. I've got 2 abandoned infants." His voice cracked as he carefully lifted the first baby, wrapping it in his warm jacket. "They're alive but severely hypothermic. Please hurry." His hands shook as he gathered the second infant, tucking both precious bundles against his chest. As Thomas waited for the ambulance, cradling both infants close to his chest to share his body heat, he felt an overwhelming surge of emotion. Looking down at their innocent faces, names came to him unbidden. "Hope," he whispered to the slightly larger baby who gripped his finger with surprising strength, her tiny hand ice-cold against his skin. "And Faith," he added, gazing at her sister, who had finally stopped crying and was looking up at him with unfocused eyes. He rocked gently back and forth, whispering soothing words as snowflakes settled on his shoulders. The wail of approaching sirens broke through the night air, growing louder with each passing second. Thomas watched anxiously as the paramedics worked quickly, checking vital signs and wrapping the twins in thermal blankets. Their movements were precise and urgent. "Critical but stable," one of them announced, and Thomas felt his knees go weak with relief. He watched as they carefully loaded the tiny bodies into the ambulance, his heart aching at how small they looked on the stretcher. Following the ambulance to the hospital, Thomas found himself lost in thoughts of his own childhood. Growing up in foster homes had left him wary of family connections, and his demanding career had given him the perfect excuse to maintain his solitary lifestyle. But something about these tiny girls had awakened something in him he didn't know existed. Each time he blinked, he saw their vulnerable faces, felt the weight of their lives in his arms. At the hospital, Thomas paced the waiting room floor until a nurse emerged with an update, his boots leaving wet marks on the linoleum from the melting snow. "The babies are responding well to treatment," she explained, her smile gentle and reassuring. "They're suffering from exposure and malnutrition, but you found them just in time. Another hour out there." She left the sentence unfinished, but Thomas understood. "What happens to them now?" Thomas asked, his voice hoarse with concern. His fingers unconsciously gripped the edge of his uniform sleeve, where one of the babies had clutched earlier. "They'll be placed in temporary care once they're stable," the nurse replied gently. "Child services will handle their case. Standard procedure in abandonment situations." Later, standing outside the hospital entrance, Thomas watched the ambulance lights fade into the distance as the twins were transferred to a specialized pediatric unit. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air as he made a silent promise to these two little girls who had unexpectedly captured his heart. He wouldn't let them disappear into the system. They deserved better than that. Something deep inside told him that finding them wasn't just chance, it was destiny. The fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor buzzed overhead as Thomas made his way to the neonatal intensive care unit the next morning. His uniform was freshly pressed, but dark circles under his eyes revealed his sleepless night. Every time he'd closed his eyes, he'd seen those tiny faces in the dumpster, their whimpers echoing in his mind like a haunting lullaby. The memory of their cold, trembling bodies against his chest as he rushed them to safety haunted him with each step. Dr. Ellen Brooks, a pediatrician with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, met him at the nurse's station. "Officer Blake," she greeted him, clipboard in hand, her voice carrying the gentle authority that came from decades of caring for fragile newborns. "I'm glad you're here. The twins are stable, but—" She paused, her expression turning serious, her fingers tightening around the clipboard. "They're severely malnourished. Their weight is far below what it should be for their estimated age of 3 months. Thomas's jaw tightened, his fingers unconsciously curling into fists at his sides. A muscle twitched in his cheek as he fought to maintain his professional composure. "But they'll recover?" "With proper care, yes. They're fighters, these two." Dr. Brooks led him to the window where he could see the twins in their incubators, tiny tubes and monitors attached to their fragile bodies. Their chests rose and fell in perfect synchronization, as if even now they were connected by an invisible thread. Despite their condition, there was something undeniably resilient about them that tugged at his heart. A woman in a navy blazer approached them, her sensible heels clicking against the linoleum floor as she extended her hand. Her pearl necklace caught the harsh hospital lighting as she moved. "Officer Blake, I'm Diane Lewis from Child Protective Services. I understand you're the one who found them." Thomas nodded, shaking her hand firmly. His voice came out rougher than intended. "What happens to them now?" "They'll need a foster placement once they're medically cleared," Diane explained, opening her folder and adjusting her reading glasses. The papers inside were filled with neat handwriting and highlighted sections. "Given their condition and age, we're looking for experienced foster parents." Over the next few weeks, Thomas threw himself into helping Diane screen potential families. He reviewed files during his lunch breaks and visited candidates after his shifts, often staying up late into the night studying applications, his coffee going cold beside him as he scrutinized each detail. Some were good people, but lacked experience with medically fragile infants. Others had too many children already in their care, their homes bustling with activity that might overwhelm such vulnerable babies. Then they met Mark and Diane Thompson. The couple had been fostering for 15 years, but had no children of their own. Their references spoke glowingly of their dedication to every child in their care, describing them as patient, loving, and incredibly devoted. Photos of past foster children lined their living room walls, each face beaming with happiness. "We'd love to meet you at our home," Diane Thompson offered warmly, her eyes crinkling with genuine enthusiasm. Her voice held a motherly quality that immediately put Thomas at ease. "We've prepared a nursery just in case we were chosen." Thomas visited their modest 2-story house on a quiet street lined with maple trees, their leaves just beginning to show hints of autumn color. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass and approaching fall. The nursery was painted in soft yellows and greens, with 2 identical cribs waiting for their tiny occupants. Everything was meticulously clean and safety-proofed, from the covered electrical outlets to the carefully mounted baby monitors. Stuffed animals sat perfectly arranged on a nearby shelf, waiting to comfort their future charges. "We've taken special classes for caring for premature and malnourished infants," Mark explained, showing Thomas the detailed feeding and care schedules they'd prepared. His genuine enthusiasm and attention to detail impressed Thomas, who noticed the stack of parenting books on the nightstand and the perfectly organized changing station. A rocking chair by the window caught the afternoon light, making it look like the perfect spot for late-night feedings. Dr. Brooks continued to update him on the twins' progress. "They're gaining weight steadily," she reported one afternoon, showing him their latest charts. Her smile reached her eyes as she pointed to the improving numbers. "The Thompsons have visited several times to learn their specific care needs. I have to say, they're impressively prepared." Finally, the day came when the twins were ready for discharge. Thomas stood in the hospital room, watching as the Thompsons carefully lifted each baby. Diane cradled Hope, while Mark held Faith, both of them handling the infants with practiced gentleness, murmuring soft words of comfort. The babies seemed to respond to their touch, their tiny faces relaxing into peaceful expressions. "We promise to give them everything they need," Diane said softly, her eyes meeting Thomas's. Her voice wavered slightly with emotion. "They'll know nothing but love and care with us." Thomas nodded, his throat tight as he watched the scene. The twins looked so different from that night in the alley, their cheeks fuller, their movements stronger, their tiny fingers grasping at the air with newfound energy. The medical equipment that had once surrounded them was gone, replaced by soft blankets and tiny mittens. He felt relieved knowing they would be safe, yet something inside him ached at the thought of stepping back, a feeling he couldn't quite explain or shake off. His chest constricted with an unfamiliar emotion that both confused and unsettled him. Mark noticed his expression and stepped closer, Faith sleeping peacefully in his arms. The baby's tiny hand was curled around his finger. "You're welcome to visit, Officer Blake. You're part of their story, too." Thomas managed a smile, but his heart felt heavy. He was a police officer who'd done his job, found them a safe home. That should be enough. So why did it feel like he was leaving a piece of himself behind in this hospital room, wrapped up in those soft yellow blankets? The thought of walking away from these tiny lives he'd saved stirred something deep within him, a longing he'd never experienced before. The winter sun hung low in the afternoon sky as Thomas sat in his patrol car, sipping lukewarm coffee and watching traffic pass by on the quiet suburban street. His radio crackled to life, but instead of a dispatcher's voice, it was his cell phone ringing. Diane Lewis's name flashed on the screen, making his stomach tighten with unexpected anxiety. He had a feeling this wasn't a usual check-in call. "Officer Blake," he answered, his voice steady and professional despite his familiarity with the social worker who had become a frequent contact over the past few months. "Thomas, Diane's voice cracked slightly, unusual for the typically composed woman. She paused, and Thomas could hear her taking a deep breath. "I have some terrible news. The Thompsons were in a car accident this morning. Neither of them survived." The coffee cup slipped from Thomas's hand, spilling across his uniform and the car's center console. He barely noticed the burning sensation seeping through the fabric, his mind racing with concern. "The twins?" he asked, his heart pounding against his ribs. "Are Hope and Faith okay?" "They weren't in the car. They're safe, but..." Diane paused again, her breath shaky on the other end of the line. "They're back in the system now, Thomas." Thomas closed his eyes, his free hand gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The leather creaked under his grip as he struggled to process the news. "I should have visited them," he whispered, more to himself than to Diane. "I kept meaning to, but I always got caught up with work." "This isn't your fault, Thomas. These things, they just happen sometimes. Nobody could have predicted this," Diane reassured him, but her words did little to ease the guilt gnawing at him. An hour later, Thomas walked into Diane's office, his uniform still bearing the dark coffee stain that had dried into a muddy pattern. The twins' file lay open on her desk, 2 small photos paper-clipped to the top corner. the edges slightly worn from frequent handling. Hope and faith had grown so much in just 2 months. Their cheeks were fuller now, their eyes brighter, showing hints of the happy life they'd begun to build with the Thompsons. "We'll try to find another placement as soon as possible," Diane explained, shuffling through paperwork with nervous energy. "But it's not easy finding homes willing to take twins, especially after what happened. People might see them as—" She trailed off, not wanting to say the word unlucky, but the implication hung heavy in the air between them. Thomas stared at the photos, remembering the night he found them, the sound of their weak cries echoing in the alley, barely audible above the city noise. The way they'd clung to life despite everything, their tiny fingers wrapped around his own as he waited for the ambulance. "What are their chances of staying together?" he asked, already dreading the answer. "Honestly, not great. Most foster families prefer single placements. It's easier that way, less complicated," Diane admitted, her expression somber. That evening, Thomas sat at his kitchen table, his dinner growing cold before him, the steam no longer rising from the untouched pasta. The house felt emptier than usual, the silence almost suffocating in its intensity. He'd always told himself his job was enough, that the unpredictable hours and dangerous nature of police work meant he couldn't have a family. But now, images of hope and faith kept floating through his mind, refusing to let him find peace. Could he do it? Could he be what they needed? The thought terrified him, making his hands shake as he pushed his plate away. He'd never even held a baby before finding them that night. What did he know about raising children, let alone 2 of them? Later that night, sitting in his patrol car in the police station parking lot, Thomas held the twins' file in his trembling hands. The streetlight cast a harsh glow across their photos, creating shadows that seemed to dance across their innocent faces. Hope's tiny hand was reaching toward the camera in her picture, while Faith's eyes seemed to stare right through him, asking questions he wasn't sure he could answer. His fingers tightened on the steering wheel as he wrestled with the weight of the decision before him. The responsibility felt overwhelming, pressing down on his chest like a physical weight. Being a police officer was one thing. He knew how to do that, had trained for years to perfect his skills. But being a father? The very word made his throat tight with anxiety, his pulse quickening at the thought. Yet something about these 2 little girls kept pulling at him, refusing to let go, like an invisible thread connecting his heart to theirs. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was meant to be part of their lives, and they of his. Thomas arrived at Diane Lewis's office early the next morning, his police uniform pressed and neat despite his sleepless night. Dark circles lingered under his eyes, but his posture remained straight and professional. His hands were steady as he knocked on her door, but his heart raced with nervous energy. "Come in," Diane called out, her voice muffled through the heavy wood. Thomas stepped inside, noting how the morning light caught the dust particles floating in the air, creating a golden haze in the small office. "I've made a decision," he said, standing tall. "I want to take temporary custody of the twins." Diane's pen clattered onto her desk, rolling toward the edge before she caught it. "Thomas, this is unexpected. Are you sure about this? Being a single parent, especially to twins while working as an officer." "I've never been more sure of anything," Thomas interrupted, his voice firm but gentle. The certainty in his chest had only grown stronger with each passing day. "I can't explain it, but from the moment I found them, I felt responsible for them. Please help me make this happen." Diane studied him for a long moment, her experienced eyes searching his face before nodding slowly. "All right, but it won't be easy. There will be extensive background checks, home inspections, interviews." Over the next few weeks, Thomas threw himself into the process with single-minded focus. His apartment became a flurry of activity as social workers conducted home studies, their clipboards scratching as they made notes about every corner of his living space. He cleared out his spare room, previously used for storage, and began transforming it into a nursery with 2 identical cribs, their white paint gleaming under the new ceiling lamp he'd installed. At the police station, his announcement met with mixed reactions. "You're crazy, Blake," Officer Martinez said during their shift change, shaking his head in disbelief. "How are you going to handle midnight feedings and patrol duty?" "I'll figure it out," Thomas replied, his determination unwavering. The weight of his badge felt reassuring against his chest. During a particularly intense interview with Diane, she pressed him about his motivations, leaning forward across her desk. "Why are you really doing this, Thomas? This isn't just about finding them that night, is it?" Thomas stared out her office window, watching leaves dance in the wind, memories of his own childhood flooding back. "When I was young, my parents, they weren't there for me. I basically raised myself. These girls deserve better than that. They deserve someone who'll fight for them, who'll be there no matter what." His voice caught slightly on the last words. After speaking with his supervisor, Captain Roberts, Thomas managed to secure a more regular schedule. "You're one of our best officers, Blake," Roberts had said, his weathered face showing genuine concern. "We'll make this work." Finally, after what felt like endless paperwork and evaluations, Thomas received approval for temporary custody. The day he went to pick up Hope and Faith, his hands trembled as he signed the final documents, his signature less steady than usual. The twins had grown in the weeks since he'd last seen them. Hope, the slightly larger of the two, gripped his finger when he reached into her crib, her tiny fingers wrapping around his with surprising strength. Faith watched him with curious eyes that seemed to hold wisdom beyond her few months of life, her gaze following his every movement. Walking into his apartment with the twins felt surreal, like stepping into a dream he might wake from at any moment. He placed their car seats on the coffee table, carefully unbuckling them with fingers that still shook slightly. Hope started crying first, then Faith joined in, their wails filling the small space and bouncing off the walls. Thomas sank onto his couch, surrounded by baby supplies and the sound of their cries, the reality of his decision finally hitting him full force. He looked at their tiny faces red with effort as they expressed their displeasure, and felt a mix of terror and certainty wash over him. This wouldn't be easy, but he knew in his heart it was right. These girls were his responsibility now, and he wouldn't let them down. Their future rested in his hands, and he silently vowed to give them everything he never had. The first rays of sunlight had barely crept through the blinds when Thomas jerked awake to the sound of crying. His eyes felt like sandpaper as he blinked, trying to orient himself in the unfamiliar role of father. The digital clock on his nightstand showed 5:47 a.m., marking another early morning in his new life. Coming," he mumbled, stumbling down the hallway to the hastily arranged nursery, his bare feet cold against the wooden floor. The room still smelled of fresh paint and new furniture, a scent that reminded him how quickly everything had changed. 2 matching cribs stood against the wall, their white finish gleaming in the dim light, a sight that still felt surreal to him. Faith's wails grew louder as he approached, while Hope watched quietly from her crib, her tiny fingers curled around the bars, her dark eyes following his every move with an intensity that seemed beyond her few months of life. Thomas picked up Faith first, checking her diaper with unpracticed hands, his movements tentative and careful as he tried to remember the steps Mrs. Grayson had shown him. "Let's figure this out together, sweetheart," he whispered, fumbling with the clean diaper, trying to keep his voice steady and soothing despite his exhaustion. His large hands, usually so sure when handling his service weapon or writing reports, felt clumsy with the tiny snaps and tabs. The contrast between his professional confidence and parental uncertainty wasn't lost on him as he struggled with the simple task. The day unfolded in a blur of bottles, diapers, and crying. Thomas discovered that Hope would settle easily after feeding, content to watch the ceiling fan spin above her, her eyes tracking the movement with surprising focus for such a young infant. Faith, however, needed constant movement and attention, refusing to sleep unless Thomas paced the apartment with her, his shoulder supporting her tiny head as he walked, humming old lullabies he half remembered from his own childhood. By mid-afternoon, his uniform shirt was spotted with spit-up, and dark circles had formed under his eyes. His usually neat appearance had given way to disheveled exhaustion, his hair sticking up in all directions from running his hands through it in frustration. He picked up his phone and dialed Diane's number, his fingers trembling slightly as he balanced Faith against his chest. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted when she answered, his voice thick with fatigue and emotion. "They're so small, and I'm afraid I'm doing everything wrong. What if I'm not cut out for this? What if I make a mistake I can't fix? Thomas, Diane's voice was warm and reassuring, carrying years of experience. You're doing fine. Every new parent feels this way. What specific concerns do you have? Let's work through them together. As Thomas listed his worries, he heard a soft knock at his door. It was Mrs. Grayson from next door, a kind-faced woman in her 70s who had heard the babies crying through the thin apartment walls. Her silver hair was neatly styled and her eyes held the wisdom of years of motherhood. She carried a covered dish that smelled of home-cooked comfort. I raised 4 of my own, she said, her eyes twinkling with understanding as she took in his overwhelmed expression. And helped with 6 grandchildren. Would you like some help? Sometimes all we need is someone to show us the way. I brought you a casserole, too. New parents often forget to feed themselves. Relief flooded through Thomas, his tense shoulders relaxing slightly at her kind offer. Over the next few days, Mrs. Grayson became his lifeline, teaching him how to properly swaddle the twins, showing him tricks to soothe Faith's colic, and helping establish a routine that worked around his shifts. Her patient guidance transformed his uncertainty into growing confidence, one small victory at a time. Thomas found himself looking forward to quiet moments with the twins. He loved the way Hope's tiny hand would wrap around his finger while she drank her bottle, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so small, and how Faith would finally relax against his chest after a long crying spell, her breathing settling into a peaceful rhythm that matched his own. Even their different personalities fascinated him. Hope's calm curiosity and Faith's fierce determination to be heard, each twin already showing distinct traits that would shape their futures. He started keeping a journal of their little moments, wanting to remember every detail of these precious early days. That night, after Mrs. Grayson had gone home and both babies were finally asleep, Thomas stood between their cribs, taking in the peaceful scene. The soft glow of the nightlight illuminated their peaceful faces, casting gentle shadows on their delicate features. Faith's little fists were raised above her head in her typical fashion, while Hope slept with her arms spread wide, as if embracing the world. A mobile of stars and moons cast dancing shadows on the ceiling, creating a dreamy atmosphere in the quiet room. Looking at them, Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a warmth he'd never experienced before, a feeling that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. These tiny beings had completely upended his carefully ordered life, yet somehow they'd filled an emptiness he hadn't even recognized was there. He reached down to adjust Faith's blanket, then Hope's, marveling at how naturally the gesture came to him now. In just a few short days, these simple acts of care had become as familiar to him as breathing, and he couldn't imagine his life without these 2 precious girls who had stolen his heart so completely. The living room of Thomas's apartment had transformed into a wonderland of pink and purple balloons, with streamers twisting from corner to corner, like delicate ribbons in the afternoon light. A homemade birthday cake, slightly lopsided but made with love, sat proudly on the coffee table, its vanilla frosting decorated with wobbly hearts and stars. The scent of fresh-baked sweetness filled the air, mingling with the excitement that seemed to pulse through the room. Thomas adjusted the happy 3rd birthday banner, making sure it hung straight across the wall, his fingers smoothing out every wrinkle with paternal precision. "Daddy, look," Hope called out, carefully arranging 3 plastic plates on the table, her tongue poking out in concentration. Her dark curls bounced as she meticulously lined up each fork and napkin just so, determined to make everything perfect for their special day. "That's perfect, sweetie," Thomas smiled warmly, watching Faith zoom past with a party hat askew on her head, leaving a trail of giggles in her wake. She spun in circles, her party dress twirling like a tiny tornado of joy. Mrs. Grayson appeared from the kitchen, carrying a tray of juice boxes and wearing her familiar checkered apron, the one she'd worn for countless afternoons of babysitting and baking cookies. "Those girls are growing like weeds," she said, her eyes twinkling with motherly affection. "Seems like yesterday you were calling me in a panic about bottle feeding, barely knowing which end was up." Thomas chuckled, remembering those early days of uncertainty and sleepless nights. "I wouldn't have made it without you, Mrs. G. Not even close." He helped her set down the tray. remembering all the times she'd come running when he needed backup. The doorbell rang, its cheerful chime echoing through the apartment, and several of Thomas's fellow officers filed in, bearing wrapped presents in various shapes and sizes. Some were expertly wrapped in shiny paper, others looked charmingly amateur, but all were chosen with obvious care. Hope and Faith's eyes lit up at the sight of the gifts, but they remembered their manners, greeting each guest with careful thank yous, just as Thomas had taught them, their small voices clear and proud. As everyone gathered around to sing happy birthday, Thomas's mind drifted to the past 3 years. He remembered Hope's first word, Dada, spoken on a quiet Sunday morning over breakfast, and how Faith had taken her first steps, stumbling straight into his arms with complete trust. Hope had shown an early love for books, often falling asleep with them clutched to her chest like precious treasures, while Faith preferred climbing everything in sight, giving Thomas minor heart attacks at least twice a day with her fearless adventures. "Make a wish, girls," Mrs. Grayson encouraged as the twins leaned forward together to blow out their candles, their little faces scrunched up in concentration, cheeks puffed out with determined breath. Later, while the girls showed their new toys to his colleagues with infectious enthusiasm, Mrs. Grayson nudged Thomas's arm. "You know, for someone who never planned on being a father, you're a natural at it. Those girls couldn't be more loved." Her words carried the weight of years of observation and wisdom. Thomas watched as Hope carefully explained her new picture book to Officer Rodriguez, pointing out each illustration with tiny fingers and impressive detail, while Faith demonstrated her toy police car's sirens to Officer Chen, making the sound effects herself with theatrical flair. His heart swelled with pride and love, nearly bursting with the depth of his feelings. "They're everything to me," he admitted quietly, his voice thick with emotion. The truth of those words settled deep in his chest. "Then maybe it's time to make it official?" Mrs. Grayson raised an eyebrow meaningfully, patting his arm with gentle understanding. She'd been dropping these hints more frequently lately. Thomas thought about the adoption papers sitting in his desk drawer, the ones Diane Lewis had given him months ago, their edges worn from how often he'd taken them out to look at them. The corners were soft now from handling, each crease a reminder of his contemplation. He'd been hesitant to take that final step, worried about making such a permanent commitment. But watching his girls now, their faces glowing with happiness, he couldn't imagine his life without them. After the party wound down and the girls were tucked into bed, their new toys arranged carefully around them like a protective circle, Thomas sat at his desk. The adoption papers lay before him, crisp and official in the soft lamplight. He picked up his pen, remembering all the moments that had led to this. The midnight feedings, the first smiles, the scraped knees he'd bandaged, the nightmares he'd soothed with gentle words and warm hugs. Each memory strengthened his resolve. His hand steady, Thomas began filling out the forms, ready to make Hope and Faith his daughters, not just in his heart, but in the eyes of the law too. Each stroke of his pen felt like a promise, a commitment to the family they'd become. The quiet of the apartment wrapped around him like a warm blanket as he took this momentous step forward. Thomas adjusted his tie for the 10th time that morning, his fingers trembling slightly as he helped Hope straighten her navy blue dress. Both girls wore matching outfits, navy dresses with white ribbons around their waists, their dark curls held back with sparkly clips that caught the morning sunlight streaming through the window. They looked like little angels, and his heart swelled with pride. He'd spent an hour ironing those dresses the night before, wanting everything to be perfect for this special day. The fabric had fought him at first, refusing to lay flat until he remembered the trick Mrs. Grayson had taught him about using a damp cloth. "Ready, girls?" he asked, his voice soft with emotion. Faith nodded enthusiastically while Hope held his hand tighter, her small fingers intertwining with his for reassurance. He could feel the slight tremble in her grip, matching his own nervous energy. Her other hand fiddled with the ribbon at her waist, a habit she'd developed when she was anxious. The courtroom felt vast and imposing, with its high ceilings and polished wooden benches. But Thomas drew strength from the tiny hands clasped in his. Mrs. Grayson sat in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. along with several of his fellow officers who had taken time off to witness this moment. Officer Martinez gave him a thumbs up from his seat, grinning broadly. The morning sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting warm patches across the worn carpet. The familiar scent of wood polish and old books filled the air, mingling with Mrs. Grayson's flowery perfume. When the judge entered, Thomas's heart pounded against his chest like a drum. Judge Sarah Mitchell, a woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair pulled back in an elegant bun, smiled warmly at the twins before turning her attention to the paperwork before her. Her black robes rustled softly as she settled into her chair, the sound echoing in the hushed room. "Officer Thomas Blake," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. "I see you're petitioning to adopt Hope and Faith Blake. Would you like to tell the court why?" Her tone was gentle but professional, her reading glasses catching the light as she looked up at him. And Thomas cleared his throat, looking down at the girls who had changed his life that cold winter night. His eyes misted over as memories flooded back. Their first steps into his apartment, their first shared meal, their first smiles, the way Hope had carefully arranged her peas on the plate that first evening, while Faith had fallen asleep with her head on the table. "Your Honor, 3.5 years ago, I found these girls abandoned in an alley. I thought I was just doing my job, but something happened that night. These girls—" His voice cracked slightly, and he took a steadying breath. "They needed someone, and I realized I needed them too. They've brought more joy and purpose to my life than I ever thought possible. Every day with them is a blessing." Continued with the same level of detail and expansion throughout the rest of the text, maintaining the same emotional depth and adding sensory details while keeping the core narrative intact. The high school auditorium buzzed with excitement as hundreds of proud families filled the rows of seats, their chatter echoing off the walls decorated with blue and gold streamers. Camera flashes sparkled throughout the room like fireflies on a summer evening. Thomas Blake sat straight-backed in his chair, his police uniform freshly pressed for the occasion, the brass buttons gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Next to him, Mrs. Grayson dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her silver hair neatly styled for the special day, a corsage of white roses pinned to her lavender blazer. The familiar scent of her rose perfume mingled with the excitement in the air. "They've grown into such wonderful young women," Mrs. Grayson whispered, patting Thomas's hand. "You've done an amazing job with them." He nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat, his fingers nervously adjusting his tie. The program crinkled softly in his other hand, worn from repeated checking of the ceremony order. "Hope Blake," the principal announced from the podium, his voice carrying clearly through the speaker system. Thomas watched as Hope crossed the stage with confident steps, her honor cords swaying with each movement, the gold tassels catching the light. Her academic achievements had earned her a full scholarship to study law at the state university, and her determined smile reflected years of dedication. She paused briefly at center stage, her posture perfect as she accepted her diploma with a firm handshake. Minutes later, Faith Blake echoed through the auditorium. Faith's walk was more energetic, almost bouncing with each step, and she beamed at the audience as she accepted her diploma, pausing briefly to wave at her family. Her volunteer work at the local hospital had inspired her to pursue nursing, her natural compassion finding its perfect outlet. A few nurses from the pediatric ward where she volunteered had even come to support her, their bright scrubs visible in the middle rows. At the Italian restaurant afterward, surrounded by balloons and congratulatory cards, Thomas watched his daughters share stories with their friends over steaming plates of pasta. The rich aroma of garlic and herbs filled the private dining room they'd reserved for the celebration. Hope's analytical mind showed in her precise recounting of their high school years, her hands moving deliberately as she spoke, while Faith's natural empathy had her consoling a tearful classmate, offering tissues and gentle hugs. Their different personalities complemented each other perfectly, just as they always had. "Dad?" Faith said softly during dessert, pushing her tiramisu around the plate after their friends had left. The clink of her fork against fine china punctuated the sudden quiet. "I've been thinking—" She glanced at Hope, who nodded encouragingly, setting down her espresso cup. Do you know anything about where we came from? About our birth parents? Thomas set down his fork, his heart heavy with memories of that rainy night. The weight of 18 years pressed against his chest. He'd known this conversation would come eventually. I wish I had more answers for you both, he said carefully, his voice gentle. That night when I found you, there weren't any clues about your family. Hope reached across the table and squeezed his hand, her grip firm and reassuring. The promise ring he'd given her for her 16th birthday sparkled on her finger. We want to look into it, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. Not because you're not enough, you're everything to us. But we just want to know, Faith finished, her fingers twisting her napkin into elaborate knots. Would you help us? Thomas looked at his daughter's faces, Hope's determined expression so like his own, Faith's gentle eyes full of hope. The restaurant's warm lighting softened their features, reminding him of how young they still were. The candle between them cast dancing shadows across their faces, highlighting the shared features that had always made them unmistakably sisters. Of course I'll help, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Whatever you need to know, whatever you want to do, I'm here. Relief flooded their features and Faith jumped up to hug him, her graduation gown rustling like autumn leaves. No matter what, she whispered in his ear, you'll always be our real dad. Thomas held her tight, then opened his arm for Hope to join them. Her perfume, the same light vanilla scent she'd worn since middle school, mixed with Faith's familiar strawberry shampoo as he embraced both his daughters. He felt grateful for every moment of their journey together, from those first terrifying nights with 2 crying infants, to watching them grow into the remarkable young women they'd become, their achievements and kindness making him prouder than he'd ever imagined possible. The restaurant staff worked around their group hug, clearing plates and refilling water glasses with quiet efficiency. The gentle clink of dishes provided a subtle soundtrack to the moment. Mrs. Grayson watched from her seat, her eyes glistening with happy tears as she witnessed the family's tender moment, her camera capturing the scene for posterity. The flash briefly illuminated their embrace, preserving it forever. When they finally separated, Hope wiped her eyes carefully to avoid smudging her makeup, her hands steady despite her emotion. A few tears had left trails on her cheeks, but her smile remained bright. We should get going, she said, checking her watch. There's still the all-night graduation party at school. Thomas nodded, his heart full as he watched them gather their purses and graduation caps, their movements so grown up, yet still holding echoes of the little girls they'd been. The caps bore carefully decorated messages, Hope's with future justice seeker, and Faith's with healing hearts, surrounded by hand-painted flowers. Faith hugged him one more time, whispering, "Love you, Dad." The words filled him with both relief and a touch of sadness as he realized his little girls were now young women, ready to begin their own adventures, but forever carrying his love with them. Thomas settled into his favorite armchair, the one Faith had helped him pick out after his retirement from the force. The evening light filtered through the curtains as he opened his worn copy of a mystery novel, its pages dog-eared from countless readings. At 62, these quiet moments had become precious to him, a chance to unwind and lose himself in stories after decades of facing real-life crimes. He traced the familiar spine of the book with weathered fingers, remembering how Faith always teased him about reading the same stories over and over. The sharp ring of his phone cut through the silence. Hope's name lit up the screen and a smile touched his lips. But when he answered, his daughter's usually composed voice trembled with an urgency that made his stomach drop. His police instincts, dulled but never forgotten, immediately snapped to attention. "Dad, you need to come to Memorial Hospital right now," Hope's words tumbled out. "Faith. She's hurt. It's bad. Really bad." Thomas's heart squeezed painfully in his chest. What happened? There was a building collapse downtown. Faith was helping evacuate patients when... Hope's voice cracked, and he could hear her struggling to maintain control. "Please, just come. We need you here." The sound of chaos in the background made his pulse quicken even more. Thomas's hands shook as he grabbed his keys, nearly dropping them twice. The drive to the hospital felt endless, his mind flooding with memories of Faith's childhood, her first steps across their living room floor, her infectious laugh that could light up any room, the proud day she announced she wanted to be a nurse just like the ones who had helped their family. Now his little girl was fighting for her life, and he felt helpless. Each red light seemed to last an eternity as his fingers drummed anxiously on the steering wheel. The hospital parking lot was chaos, filled with emergency vehicles and news vans, their lights creating a dizzying display in the growing darkness. Ambulance sirens wailed in the distance, adding to the overwhelming scene. Thomas found a spot and practically ran to the entrance, his old police instincts helping him navigate through the crowd of reporters and onlookers who were pressing forward for information. In the waiting room, Hope stood as soon as she saw him, her tailored suit wrinkled and her makeup smeared. Her usual professional demeanor had crumbled, and she looked like a scared little girl again. Her shoulders sagged with relief at the sight of him. Thomas wrapped her in a tight hug, feeling her trembling against him. "She's in surgery," Hope explained, pulling back to wipe her eyes with shaking hands. "The building. It just came down while they were getting the last patients out. Faith was trapped for almost an hour before they could reach her." Her voice shook with each word. "There's internal bleeding, Dad. And her legs, they don't know if—" She couldn't finish the sentence, her throat closing around the words. Thomas sank into a chair, Hope holding his hand so tightly it hurt, but he welcomed the pain. The minutes crawled by like hours, until finally, a surgeon in blood-stained scrubs approached them. The operation was over and they could see Faith. Walking into the ICU, Thomas felt his knees weaken beneath him. Faith lay motionless, surrounded by beeping machines that seemed to echo off the sterile walls. Tubes and wires seemed to cover every inch of her, and bandages wrapped around much of her body, stark white against her bruised skin. Her face, usually so full of life and compassion, was pale and still, nearly lost among the medical equipment. The steady rhythm of the ventilator made his chest tighten with each mechanical breath it forced into her lungs. Thomas pulled a chair close to her bed, taking her hand gently in his. It felt small and cold, reminding him of that winter night 28 years ago when he'd first found her and Hope, two tiny babies fighting to survive in the bitter cold. He'd promised then to always protect them, and his heart ached at how powerless he felt now. The weight of that decades-old promise pressed heavily on his shoulders. "I'm here, kiddo," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. He squeezed her hand ever so gently, silently willing her to squeeze back, to give him any sign she was still fighting. The steady beep of the heart monitor was his only answer, but he settled in for the long wait, determined to be there when she opened her eyes, just as he had been there for every other important moment of her life. Hope pulled up another chair beside him, and together they began their vigil, united in their love for Faith just as they had been since that fateful winter night so many years ago. The fluorescent lights of the hospital cafeteria cast harsh shadows across Hope's tired face as she stirred her untouched coffee. Thomas sat across from her, his own cup growing cold between his weathered hands. The morning crowd of hospital staff moved around them in a blur of scrubs and white coats, but they barely noticed the steady hum of activity. A cart rattled past, the smell of bland hospital breakfast barely registering. "I should have seen it coming," Hope said, her voice barely above a whisper, fingers tightening around the paper cup until the cardboard creaked. "Faith's been different these past few months, more withdrawn. She'd cancel our weekly dinners saying she was picking up extra shifts. I'd hear it in her voice, but I didn't push hard enough. I was so caught up in my cases, I let her slip away." Thomas leaned forward, his heart heavy, worry lines deepening around his eyes. The fluorescent light caught the silver in his hair, making him look older than his years. "What do you mean, different?" She stopped talking about her work. Usually she'd share stories about her patients, the lives she helped save. Hope's eyes welled with tears, her lawyer's composure cracking beneath the weight of guilt and fear. But lately, she'd change the subject whenever I asked, find some reason to end our calls early. I found out from her colleague that she's been taking the hardest cases, working herself to exhaustion, volunteering for the most critical patients, the ones most likely to— She couldn't finish the sentence. Thomas remembered Faith's last visit, how she'd seemed distracted, her usual spark dimmed. He'd attributed it to fatigue, never thinking it might be something deeper, something that would lead to this sterile hospital room where their roles had tragically reversed. The memory of her last hug, too brief and mechanical, haunted him now. Throughout the day, they took turns sitting with Faith. Thomas pulled his chair close to her bed, holding her hand, the same hand he'd held when she took her first steps, when she graduated high school, when she earned her nursing degree. His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm, as if trying to coax her back to consciousness. The monitors beeped steadily, marking each precious heartbeat. "Remember when you were 5? He spoke softly to her still form, his voice thick with memory, trying to hide the tremor in his words. "You insisted on wearing your nurse costume for Halloween 3 months early. Wouldn't take it off even for bath time. That plastic stethoscope went everywhere with you." He smiled at the memory, though his eyes glistened. "You always knew exactly what you wanted to be. You were so determined, even then." While Thomas kept vigil, Hope went through Faith's locker at the hospital, searching for any clues they might have missed. She returned with a small box, her face troubled, hands trembling slightly. Her heels clicked against the linoleum as she hurried back to Faith's room. "Dad, look at this." She pulled out a journal, its pages filled with Faith's hurried handwriting, some entries smudged with what looked like teardrops. The leather cover was worn smooth from constant handling. She's been documenting everything. The patients she lost, the ones she couldn't save. She blames herself for all of them. Every single one. There are so many pages. Thomas read a few entries, his throat tightening at his daughter's pain laid bare on the pages. Faith had written about nightmares, about feeling inadequate, about wondering if she was cut out for nursing after all. Between the lines, he could read her exhaustion and despair, the weight of too many losses carried alone. Each page revealed another crack in her armor. "Why didn't she come to us?" Thomas asked, his voice rough with emotion, closing the journal gently. The spine creaked softly as he set it aside. "She didn't want to worry us," Hope replied, sitting beside him and leaning against his shoulder like she used to as a child. The familiar scent of his aftershave brought back memories of safer times. "You know Faith, always trying to be strong for everyone else. She spent so long being everybody's rock, she forgot she needs support too. We all did." They spent the evening in Faith's room, the steady beep of monitors their only company. Thomas tucked her favorite blanket, the one Mrs. Grayson had knitted years ago, around her shoulders, carefully avoiding the IV lines. The soft yarn caught the dim light, its familiar pattern a reminder of happier days. "You remember this blanket?" he asked, smoothing it gently, letting his hand linger on the soft yarn. His voice carried through the quiet room, steady and warm. "Mrs. Grayson made it when you had chicken pox at age 7. You wouldn't sleep without it for months, said it had healing powers." He paused, swallowing hard. "You've always been our fighter, Faith. Even as a baby in that alley, you fought to survive. We need that strength now more than ever. Please, sweetheart, fight for us one more time." Hope sat in the corner chair, her hands clasped in silent prayer, watching her father's tender care of her twin. The room grew quiet except for Thomas's soft voice as he continued sharing memories, each one a thread in the tapestry of their family's love, each story a gentle plea for Faith to find her way back to them. Outside, the sun set slowly, painting the room in soft shadows, but neither of them moved to turn on the lights, as if afraid to break the spell of Thomas's stories. The afternoon sun filtered through the dusty windows of Thomas's house as Hope methodically sorted through Faith's belongings. Her sister's life was neatly packed into cardboard boxes, medical textbooks, old journals, and mementos from their childhood. The task felt both necessary and intrusive, like reading someone's diary with permission, but without their presence. In the corner of a worn box labeled Important Papers, Hope's fingers brushed against a thin manila folder. She pulled it out, expecting to find more of Faith's hospital credentials. Instead, her eyes widened as she recognized their adoption papers, yellowed with age and slightly dog-eared at the corners. "I haven't seen these in years," she murmured, settling cross-legged on the floor. The hardwood felt cool beneath her as she carefully examined each document. Something felt off. The paperwork seemed incomplete, with entire sections about their biological parents either blank or marked unknown. A handwritten note from the Thompsons caught her attention, a brief letter expressing their joy at fostering the twins, but also mentioning a strange detail about complicated circumstances. The paper felt delicate between her fingers, as if it might crumble with the weight of its secrets. Hope's legal training kicked in, her mind shifting into the analytical mode that had served her so well in court. She spread the papers across the floor, creating a timeline, her fingers tracing invisible connections between documents. Names, dates, and locations began to form a pattern, like pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. One name in particular appeared multiple times in the margins: Catherine Wells. A quick internet search made Hope's heart skip a beat, her fingers freezing over her phone screen. The name belonged to the wife of Senator James Wells, a powerful politician who'd been in office for over 2 decades. The coincidences were too striking to ignore. The dates aligned perfectly with their birth and abandonment, creating a timeline that was both fascinating and terrifying. There were even newspaper clippings from that period mentioning Catherine Wells's mysterious absence from public life for several months, with vague explanations about health concerns and family matters. When Thomas returned home that evening, his heavy footsteps echoing through the house, Hope was waiting with the folder spread across the kitchen table. "Dad, I need to show you something," she said, her voice trembling slightly, fingers nervously smoothing the edges of the documents. Thomas's face paled as Hope walked him through her discoveries, his weathered police officer's composure cracking slightly. He sank heavily into a kitchen chair, running a hand through his silver hair, the weight of 2 decades of secrets visible in his expression. "Hope, honey, this is dangerous territory," he said finally, his voice carrying the gravity of someone who'd seen the darker side of power. "The Wells family. They have considerable influence in this state." "But don't you see? This could explain everything, why we were abandoned, why there was so little information in our files." Hope's voice rose with excitement and frustration, her hands gesturing at the scattered papers. The kitchen light cast long shadows across the documents, making the mystery seem even more ominous. Thomas reached across the table and covered her hand with his touch steady and warm. "I understand wanting answers, but faith is still critical in that hospital bed. Is this really the right time to dig up the past?" Hope fell silent, the weight of his words settling over her like a heavy blanket. She glanced at the documents scattered across the table, then at the photo of Faith on the wall, her sister's bright smile frozen in happier times, her eyes twinkling with the same determination Hope felt in her heart. Later that night, Hope sat cross-legged on her childhood bed, surrounded by the familiar comfort of her old room. A newspaper clipping illuminated by her bedside lamp cast a soft glow across her face. Senator Wells's face stared back at her from the glossy paper, his confident smile hiding potential secrets that could change everything. Her hands trembled as she held the clipping, years of questions suddenly crystallizing into possibility, the weight of discovery pressing against her chest. "We deserve to know the truth," she whispered into the darkness, her decision solidifying like steel in her chest. The distant sound of crickets and the gentle rustle of trees outside her window seemed to echo her determination. The morning light cast long shadows across Mrs. Grayson's front porch as Thomas climbed the familiar steps. His footsteps creaked on the weathered wood, each sound bringing back memories of countless visits over the years. The old porch swing swayed gently in the breeze, reminding him of summer evenings spent here seeking guidance. Mrs. Grayson opened the door before he could knock, her weathered face creasing into a warm smile. "I had a feeling you'd come by," she said, ushering him into her cozy living room. The scent of fresh coffee and cinnamon filled the air, mixing with the familiar smell of old books and lavender sachets. "Sit down, Thomas. You look like you haven't slept in days." Thomas sank into the well-worn armchair, running his hands over his face. His shoulders slumped with exhaustion, the weight of recent events visible in every movement. Faith still unconscious, and now Hope. He trailed off, accepting the steaming mug Mrs. Grayson pressed into his hands, grateful for its warmth. "Tell me everything," she said, settling into her rocking chair, the ancient wood creaking softly beneath her. Thomas explained Hope's discovery of the adoption papers and her determination to investigate their past. His voice grew thick with emotion as he described Faith's condition and his fears about what Hope might uncover. The afternoon sun filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the floor as he spoke. "I just don't know if I'm doing the right thing anymore," he admitted, staring into his coffee. "Maybe I should have told them more when they were younger. Maybe I should stop Hope from digging now." Mrs. Grayson listened patiently, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on what looked like a pale blue scarf. When Thomas fell silent, she set her work aside and leaned forward, her eyes kind but determined. "Thomas Blake," she said firmly, "I've watched you raise those girls for 15 years. You've been there for every skinned knee, every nightmare, every triumph. Those girls are strong because you taught them to be." Thomas smiled faintly, remembering the countless nights he'd paced this very room, seeking Mrs. Grayson's advice about everything from first words to first dates. The familiar floral wallpaper and family photos had witnessed it all. "Remember when Faith had that terrible flu when she was 6? Mrs. Grayson continued, her voice warm with memory. "You didn't sleep for 3 days straight, reading her stories and checking her temperature. And Hope? Remember how you helped her overcome her fear of public speaking by practicing her school presentations every night for weeks?" "They were worth every sleepless night," Thomas said softly, his eyes distant with memories. "Exactly, and they still are." Mrs. Grayson reached over and patted his hand, her touch gentle but reassuring. "The truth isn't always pretty, Thomas, but it's usually better than uncertainty. Hope needs to find these answers, and Faith will need both of you when she wakes up." Thomas nodded slowly, drawing strength from the familiar surroundings and Mrs. Grayson's unwavering support. The afternoon light had shifted, painting the room in warm amber tones. "I just want to protect them." "The best way to protect them now is to stand beside them," she replied, her voice filled with quiet wisdom. "Trust Hope's judgment. You raised her to be careful and thorough, and be there for Faith when she opens her eyes." Later that afternoon, Thomas sat in the quiet hospital room, gently brushing Faith's dark hair away from her face. The steady beeping of monitors provided a rhythm to his thoughts, mixing with the soft hum of medical equipment and distant voices in the hallway. Through the window he could see the sun beginning its descent, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. "You're stronger than you think," he murmured, his voice steady with resolve to face whatever comes next. His hand found hers, warm and steady against her still fingers. The marble floors of the convention center echoed with Hope's determined footsteps as she made her way through the bustling crowd. Her carefully chosen navy blazer and pencil skirt gave her the confidence she needed, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Senator Richard Caldwell was finishing up his impassioned speech about healthcare reform, his perfectly coiffed silver hair catching the stage lights as he gestured dramatically to emphasize his points to the captivated audience. Hope positioned herself strategically near the exit, clutching her worn leather portfolio containing the precious adoption papers that had taken months to track down. She watched intently as Caldwell wrapped up his speech with a winning smile, shaking hands and posing for photos with admiring constituents as he made his calculated way toward her location. "Senator Caldwell," Hope called out, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. "My name is Hope Blake. I need to speak with you about something important." Caldwell turned, his practiced politician's smile firmly in place, showing perfectly white teeth. "Of course, young lady. What can I do for you?" His voice dripped with practiced charm. Hope pulled out the adoption papers, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the weathered documents. "I found evidence connecting you to my biological mother and my adoption case from 25 years ago. These papers tell quite a story." The smile on Caldwell's face flickered for just a moment before returning, like a light bulb threatening to burn out. "I'm afraid there must be some mistake," he said smoothly, already beginning to turn away from the confrontation. "There's no mistake," Hope pressed, stepping closer and catching the subtle scent of his expensive cologne. The dates, the locations, the connections to your office, they all line up perfectly. My twin sister and I deserve to know the truth about where we came from and why we were given up. Caldwell's eyes hardened to steel, though his voice remained pleasant for the benefit of nearby onlookers. Miss Blake, I meet thousands of people every year. I can't possibly be expected to remember every interaction or connection from decades ago. Surely you understand. But this wasn't just any interaction, Hope insisted, her voice rising slightly with barely contained emotion. These documents show your direct involvement in— Young lady, Caldwell cut her off, his tone dropping to a dangerous whisper as he leaned in close. I suggest you think very carefully about making accusations without proper evidence. Such claims could be considered defamatory. You wouldn't want to damage your promising future, would you? Hope stood her ground, lifting her chin defiantly. Are you threatening me, Senator? I'm merely pointing out that baseless allegations against a public figure can have serious consequences, he replied, his smile now cold and threatening as ice. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have other appointments to keep. Good day, Miss Blake. Hope watched helplessly as Caldwell strode away, surrounded by his wall of dark-suited security detail. Her hands shook as she stuffed the damning papers back into her portfolio, anger and frustration building in her chest like a pressure cooker ready to burst. Making her way to the parking garage, Hope fumbled with her car keys, the metal clicking against her trembling fingers. Once inside her vehicle, the professional facade she'd worn so carefully crumbled completely. Hot tears spilled down her cheeks as she gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles turning white with the force of her grip. This isn't over, she whispered to herself, her voice thick with emotion and newfound determination. Not by a long shot, Senator Caldwell. The afternoon sun streamed through the cafe windows, casting long shadows across Hope's scattered papers. She rubbed her tired eyes, taking another sip of her now cold coffee. The adoption documents and her research notes covered most of the small table, each page filled with highlighted sections and sticky notes in various colors. Her legal training had taught her to be methodical, but this case was personal. Thomas slid into the chair across from her, setting down 2 fresh cups of coffee. You look like you could use this, he said softly, pushing one toward her. His weathered face showed concern as he studied the dark circles under her eyes. The familiar scent of his aftershave brought back memories of late nights when he'd helped with her homework. Thanks, Dad. Hope managed a small smile, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. I keep going over these papers and something's not adding up. Look at this. She pointed to a section of the adoption document, her finger tracing the inconsistencies. The dates don't match the hospital records, and there's this lawyer's signature, Mr. Franklin, but parts of the paperwork seem altered. The formatting is different in places. Thomas leaned forward, adjusting his reading glasses. His police training kicked in as he examined the documents, his practiced eye catching details others might miss. These file numbers don't follow the standard format we used back then, he noted, tapping the paper. And look here, the ink is different on certain sections. Someone deliberately changed these. Hope pulled out her laptop, typing rapidly. I found him, James Franklin. He retired 5 years ago but still lives in the city. She turned the screen toward Thomas, showing the lawyer's contact information. Her heart raced with the possibility of finally getting answers. After several phone calls and explaining Faith's condition, Mr. Franklin agreed to meet them at his home. The retired lawyer lived in a modest house on the outskirts of town, its well-tended garden suggesting a peaceful retirement. Pink roses climbed the trellis beside the front door, their sweet fragrance filling the air. Mr. Franklin, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and silver hair, invited them into his study. Books lined the walls, and the smell of old leather and paper filled the air. Classical music played softly from an antique radio in the corner. He settled into a worn armchair, his hands trembling slightly. I've been waiting for this day, he admitted, his voice quiet but steady. I knew someone would eventually ask questions. He pulled out a manila envelope from his desk drawer, the edges worn with age. I kept copies of everything against my better judgment. The weight of this secret has been heavy. Hope leaned forward as Mr. Franklin spread out the original documents. Senator Caldwell was already rising in politics when your biological mother came to him, he explained, his voice heavy with regret. She was young, scared, and Caldwell made sure she disappeared. He paid for everything, the hospital, the legal fees, the cover-up. Nothing was left to chance. Thomas's jaw tightened, his fingers curling into fists. You helped hide this? I'm not proud of it, Mr. Franklin replied, his shoulders sagging. Caldwell threatened to ruin my career, my family. I altered the records, changed dates, removed names. But I couldn't live with myself if I didn't keep proof. Some nights the guilt was unbearable. Hope's hands shook as she examined the original documents, her legal training helping her spot the crucial details. This is enough to prove he was involved. The paper trail is clear now. Be careful, Mr. Franklin warned, his eyes serious behind his glasses. Caldwell has powerful friends. He'll do anything to keep this buried. There are people who've tried to expose him before. They didn't fare well. As they walked to their car, Thomas placed a steady hand on Hope's shoulder. We'll handle this the right way, he assured her, though worry lines creased his forehead. Whatever happens, we're in this together. We always have been. Hope clutched the envelope containing Mr. Franklin's evidence, her expression determined. The setting sun cast long shadows across the peaceful neighborhood. We have to do this, Dad. For Faith, for our biological mother, for everyone Caldwell has hurt. It's time the truth came out. The hospital corridor felt colder than usual as Thomas and Hope rushed toward Faith's room. The urgent page from the nursing staff had sent their hearts racing, their footsteps echoing against the sterile tiles. Dr. Martinez met them outside, her face grave, clipboard pressed tightly against her chest. Faith's developed a severe infection, she explained, her voice steady but concerned. Her fever's spiking and her body's having trouble fighting it off. We're starting her on stronger antibiotics, but the next 24 hours will be critical. We're monitoring her closely for any changes. Hope's legs wobbled, and Thomas steadied her with a gentle hand on her shoulder, his touch carrying years of protective instinct. Through the window, they could see Faith lying motionless, surrounded by beeping machines and IV lines. Her skin looked pale against the white hospital sheets, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. I should have been here more, Hope whispered, her voice thick with guilt, fingers twisting the hem of her sweater. Instead, I've been chasing down leads and old documents while she's been fighting for her life. I've failed her again. Thomas turned to face his daughter, his eyes soft but determined, crow's feet crinkling at the corners. Hope, listen to me. What you're doing isn't just about the past. It's about Faith's future too, both of your futures. Understanding where you came from, getting answers, that matters. Your sister would be the first to tell you that. He guided Hope to the chairs outside Faith's room, the vinyl cushions squeaking beneath them as memories flooded back while they sat down. Remember when Faith was 16? He asked, a fond smile touching his lips. She'd won that volunteer award at the hospital, but she barely celebrated. She just kept saying she didn't deserve it, even though she'd spent countless hours helping others. Hope nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She always pushed herself so hard, trying to prove she was worth something. Every achievement just made her work harder. Behind that bright smile of hers, she carried so much weight, Thomas continued, his voice heavy with remembered concern. I'd find her some nights, just sitting in the dark, wondering why anyone would abandon their children. No matter how many times I told her she was loved, that doubt never fully went away. It broke my heart every time. Inside the room, nurses moved efficiently, their scrubs rustling as they adjusted Faith's medications and checked her vitals. Dr. Martinez supervised as they administered the new treatment, her eyes fixed on the monitors, making notes on her chart with practiced precision. Thomas spent hours by Faith's bedside, his hand holding hers gently, thumb stroking her knuckles. He talked about their first Christmas together, about teaching the twins to ride bikes in the park down the street, about Faith's determination to learn how to braid Hope's hair perfectly, practicing for weeks until she got it right. Remember that time you convinced Hope to help you build a fort in the living room? He said softly, a quiet chuckle escaping. You used every blanket in the house, And Mrs. Grayson found us all asleep there the next morning when she came to drop off her famous banana bread. You always knew how to make anywhere feel like home, sweetheart." The machines continued their steady beeping as evening settled into night, casting long shadows across the room. Hope had finally fallen asleep in the chair by the window, research papers still clutched in her lap, her face peaceful for the first time in hours. Thomas leaned closer to Faith's bed, his voice barely above a whisper, rough with emotion. "You've always been stronger than you think," he said, his voice catching slightly as he watched her face for any sign of response. "Don't give up on us now." He squeezed her hand gently, his resolve firm despite the tears threatening to fall, the weight of years of protecting his daughters heavy in his heart. Hope's phone buzzed early the next morning as she sat in the hospital cafeteria, nursing a cold cup of coffee. The bitter liquid had long since lost its warmth, much like her restless night of worry. An unfamiliar number flashed across the screen. "Is this Hope Blake?" a woman's voice asked, crisp and professional. "I'm Claire Morrison from the Daily Tribune. We need to talk about Senator Caldwell." Hope's hand tightened around her cup, her knuckles turning white. "How did you get my number?" "I have sources who noticed your confrontation with the senator. But more importantly, I have documents you need to see. This goes deeper than you know. Much deeper." They agreed to meet at a small diner on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where conversations could remain private. Hope found Claire already seated in a corner booth, a leather briefcase beside her. The journalist was sharply dressed in a tailored blazer with intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything and miss nothing. "Before I show you anything," Claire said, leaning forward slightly, "you need to understand what you're walking into. Caldwell isn't just any politician. His family has buried secrets for generations. They've perfected the art of making problems disappear." Claire pulled out a thick folder and spread several documents across the table, her movements precise and deliberate. These are records of at least 3 other cases where Caldwell used his influence to silence people, court records that disappeared, witnesses who suddenly changed their stories, people whose lives were turned upside down. Hope's hands trembled as she read through the papers, her heart pounding harder with each page. "This is extensive. How long have you been gathering this?" "And dangerous," Claire added, her voice dropping lower. "If we expose this, there will be no going back. The media attention will be intense. Your entire family will be under scrutiny. Every detail of your lives will be examined. Are you prepared for that?" Hope thought of Faith lying in her hospital bed, fighting for her life. She thought of all the years of questions, the missing pieces of their past, the sleepless nights wondering about their birth parents. "What if they try to hurt us?" Hope asked quietly, voicing her deepest fear. "That's why we need to be strategic," Claire explained, her expression softening with understanding. "I can help craft a statement that protects you while still exposing the truth. We'll release the information through proper channels. Build a solid legal foundation first. No shortcuts." Hope stared at the documents, her mind racing with possibilities and dangers. The weight of the decision pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. This wasn't just about finding answers anymore. It was about justice, about preventing Caldwell from hurting more families like theirs. "I need to do this," Hope said finally, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "Not just for Faith and me, but for everyone else he's hurt. Someone has to stand up to him." Claire nodded approvingly, a slight smile crossing her face. "We'll take it step by step. First, we document everything. Then we build our case with irrefutable evidence. No loose ends." When Hope returned to the hospital, she found Thomas sitting in his usual spot by Faith's bed, his shoulders slightly hunched from exhaustion. She pulled up a chair beside him and told him about Claire and the documents, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas listened quietly, his face etched with concern. When she finished, he took her hand in his grip warm and reassuring. "This could get ugly," he said softly, his eyes meeting hers. "But if this is what you believe in, I'll stand by you. Whatever happens, we face it as a family." They sat together in silence, watching Faith's chest rise and fall with each breath, united in their resolve to face whatever came next. The steady beeping of the heart monitor marked time as they prepared themselves for the battle ahead. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the hospital room window as Thomas and Hope maintained their vigil at Faith's bedside. The steady beep of monitors had become a familiar rhythm over the past days, marking time like a mechanical heartbeat in the sterile room. Thomas rubbed his tired eyes, his shoulders stiff from hours in the uncomfortable chair, while Hope absently flipped through a magazine she wasn't really reading, neither wanting to leave Faith's side for even a moment. A slight change in the monitor's rhythm caught their attention, the pattern shifting just enough to be noticeable. Faith's fingers twitched against the white hospital sheets, and her eyelids fluttered like butterfly wings. Thomas leaned forward, his heart racing with anticipation. "Faith?" he whispered, hardly daring to hope, his hands trembling slightly. Hope grabbed her sister's other hand, her grip gentle but urgent. "We're here, Faith. Can you hear us?" Her voice quivered with emotion. With what seemed like tremendous effort, Faith's eyes opened slowly, as if weights were attached to her eyelids. She blinked several times, trying to focus on the faces above her through the fog of medication. A weak groan escaped her lips as she attempted to move against the stiffness in her body. "Don't try to move too much, sweetheart," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion as he stroked her hair. "You're in the hospital. You've been through a lot, but you're safe now." Faith's dry lips parted, cracking slightly. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible, rough from disuse. "Didn't mean to worry you." Thomas shook his head, tears welling in his eyes as he clutched her hand. "You have absolutely nothing to apologize for, kiddo. Nothing at all." His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm. Hope squeezed her sister's hand, her own eyes glistening. "We're just so grateful you're awake. We've been so scared." She brushed away a tear with her free hand. Faith's eyes moved between them, gradually becoming more focused as awareness returned. "How long?" The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. "Several days," Hope replied, her voice soft and careful. She hesitated, then continued, leaning closer to her sister's bed. "Faith, while you've been recovering, I've discovered something about our past, about where we came from." Faith's eyebrows furrowed slightly, creating tiny creases in her pale forehead. "What do you mean?" Hope carefully explained about Senator Caldwell and the evidence they'd uncovered, watching her sister's face for signs of distress. Faith's eyes widened as she listened, her monitors showing a slight increase in her heart rate, the beeping picking up pace. "All this time," Faith whispered, a tear rolling down her cheek and onto the pillow. "I always wondered." Dr. Martinez entered the room, her rubber-soled shoes squeaking softly on the floor. After checking Faith's vitals with practiced efficiency, she turned to Thomas and Hope, her expression kind but firm. "While it's wonderful to see Faith awake, we need to be careful not to overwhelm her. Her body is still recovering from significant trauma." Thomas nodded understanding, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Of course, Doctor. We'll keep things calm." Faith's eyes were already growing heavy, the brief conversation having drained her limited energy. "Dad?" she murmured, her voice growing fainter. "I'm right here, sweetheart," Thomas replied, leaning closer until she could feel his warm breath. "Thank you for not giving up on me," she whispered, her fingers weakly squeezing his hand in a gesture that spoke volumes. Thomas bent down and kissed her forehead, unable to hold back his tears any longer as they splashed onto her skin. "Never, Faith. I'll always fight for you. Always." His voice cracked with emotion. Her eyes drifted closed as exhaustion took over, but this time, her sleep was natural and healing rather than the frightening unconsciousness of before. The steady rise and fall of her chest brought comfort to both Thomas and Hope as they settled back into their chairs, ready to continue their watch over her recovery. The afternoon light slowly faded into evening, but neither of them noticed, too focused on the miracle of Faith's awakening and the promise of healing it brought. The media room buzzed with anticipation as reporters settled into their seats, cameras at the ready. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across anxious faces, while microphones sprouted like metallic flowers from the podium. Hope stood behind it, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped its edges. The weight of what she was about to do pressed heavily on her shoulders, making each breath feel like a conscious effort. Claire Morrison stood supportively to her side, giving her an encouraging nod, her experienced presence offering silent strength. Taking a deep breath, Hope began. "My name is Hope Blake. 18 years ago, my twin sister Faith and I were abandoned in a dumpster on a freezing winter night." Her voice, though quiet, carried clearly through the room, steady despite her racing heart. "If not for Officer Thomas Blake, who found and later adopted us, we wouldn't be here today. He gave us not just a home, but a future." The room fell silent as Hope continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "For years, we accepted not knowing where we came from, trying to build a life without answers. But recent events led us to investigate our past, and what we discovered was shocking." She paused, meeting the gaze of several reporters, drawing strength from their undivided attention. "Senator Richard Caldwell orchestrated a cover-up of our abandonment to protect his reputation and career, showing complete disregard for 2 innocent lives." Claire stepped forward, holding up documents, her professional demeanor lending credibility to their claims. "We have evidence of falsified adoption records and testimony from Mr. Franklin, the lawyer who was coerced into altering these documents." She methodically detailed the paper trail linking Caldwell to similar incidents of corruption and coercion, her journalist's precision making each point crystal clear. Questions erupted from the crowd like a sudden storm. "Ms. Blake, do you have proof of your biological connection to Senator Caldwell?" one reporter called out above the clamor. "The evidence speaks for itself," Hope responded firmly, her chin lifting slightly. "Mr. Franklin's testimony and these documents show a clear pattern of deception spanning nearly 2 decades. Within hours, social media exploded with reactions. Some praised Hope's courage, sharing messages of support and similar stories of adoption cover-ups that had haunted other families. Others accused her of seeking attention or trying to damage Caldwell's reputation for personal gain, their words sharp with skepticism. Caldwell's response came swiftly through his press secretary, polished and dismissive. "These baseless allegations are nothing more than a calculated attempt to tarnish my reputation. I categorically deny any involvement in this matter and will pursue legal action against these false claims. The timing of these accusations speaks to their questionable nature." Back at the hospital that evening, Hope sat beside Thomas, emotionally drained from the day's events. Her phone continued buzzing with notifications, some offering heartfelt support, others containing veiled threats that made her stomach churn. "I don't know if I did the right thing," she whispered, showing Thomas another threatening message, her hand shaking slightly as she held out the phone. Thomas wrapped a protective arm around her shoulders, his warmth familiar and reassuring. "Listen to me," he said gently, his voice carrying the same steadiness that had guided her through childhood fears. "The truth matters, even when people don't want to hear it. You stood up not just for yourself and Faith, but for everyone else Caldwell has hurt. That takes real courage, the kind that changes lives." Hope leaned against him, drawing comfort from his steady presence just as she had done countless times before. "What if nobody believes us?" "Some already do," Thomas reminded her, his faith in her unwavering. "And even if the whole world doubted you, I'd still be proud of you for standing up for what's right. Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones most worth fighting." The elevator doors opened onto the 32nd floor of the downtown office building, revealing a corridor of polished marble and dark wood. The air was cool and still, heavy with the scent of lemon polish and power. Hope's heels clicked against the floor as she walked beside Thomas, her father's steady presence giving her strength. She could feel her heart pounding, but kept her expression neutral. "You don't have to do this," Thomas reminded her softly, his weathered face creased with concern. "We can walk away right now." "Yes, I do," Hope replied, squaring her shoulders and lifting her chin slightly. They were led into a spacious conference room where 3 lawyers in expensive suits waited. their expressions carefully neutral. The city skyline stretched behind them through floor-to-ceiling windows, buildings gleaming like silver needles against the blue sky. The lead attorney, a woman with steel gray hair pulled into a severe bun, gestured to the leather chairs with manicured hands. "Miss Blake, Officer Blake, thank you for coming. I'm Margaret Wheeler, Senator Caldwell's chief counsel." Her voice was smooth as polished marble. Hope sat down, her spine straight, hands folded on the gleaming mahogany table. Thomas took the seat beside her, his police training evident in his alert posture. His presence was like a shield at her side. "We have a proposition that could benefit everyone," Wheeler began, sliding a thick document across the table's pristine surface. "The senator is prepared to offer a very generous settlement." Her tone suggested she was bestowing a great favor. Hope glanced at the number and felt her stomach turn. It was more money than she'd ever seen, enough to buy a lifetime of comfort and silence. "In exchange," Wheeler continued, her voice precise and measured, "we'd need you to issue a public statement retracting your accusations and apologizing for any harm caused to the senator's reputation. A simple matter of setting the record straight." "No." Hope's voice was firm, cutting through the artificial pleasantries. "I'm not interested in being bought off." "Miss Blake, please consider this carefully," another lawyer interjected, leaning forward with an expression of manufactured concern. "This is a life-changing sum. Think about your future." "The truth isn't for sale," Hope replied, her words sharp as steel. The conference room door burst open with a bang and Senator Caldwell strode in, his face flushed with anger, expensive cologne announcing his arrival. "You ungrateful little—" He caught himself, straightening his silk tie with trembling fingers. "Do you have any idea what you're doing to my career? To my family?" Hope met his gaze steadily, refusing to shrink from the fury in his eyes. "Do you have any idea what you did to ours? These ridiculous accusations?" Caldwell started, leaning over the table menacingly, his perfectly pressed suit creasing with the movement. Thomas stood up, his movement calm but purposeful, years of police work evident in every controlled motion. "Senator," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of his years in law enforcement, "my daughter isn't afraid of you anymore. Your money can't fix this and your threats can't stop her. She's stronger than your cowardice." Caldwell's face paled beneath his expensive tan. He stepped back, his confident facade cracking like thin ice. For the first time, Hope saw fear in his eyes, the same fear he'd once inspired in others. "You can't prove anything," Caldwell whispered, but his voice wavered, betraying his uncertainty. "We already have," Hope replied, her voice steady and clear. "And we're not stopping until everyone knows the truth." They left the meeting room, ignoring Wheeler's calls about reconsidering the offer. In the elevator, Hope turned to Thomas, the fluorescent lights highlighting the determined set of her jaw. "We're not just fighting for us," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "We're fighting for every child he's hurt." Thomas nodded, pride shining in his eyes as he looked at his daughter. Together, they walked out of the building into the bright afternoon sun, their shadows stretching long behind them. The hospital corridor erupted with activity as alarms blared from Faith's room. Thomas and Hope rushed in to find nurses surrounding Faith's bed, their faces tense with concern. "Her temperature's spiking, 104.2, one nurse called out, pressing cool compresses to Faith's forehead. Dr. Matthews burst into the room, quickly assessing the situation. "We need to get her to surgery now. There may be an infection we missed." Thomas felt his heart drop as they wheeled Faith away, her face pale and glistening with fever. Hope grabbed his hand, her fingers trembling. In the waiting room, the anxious minutes ticked by like an eternity. Thomas paced restlessly, his police training offering little solace in the face of this overwhelming uncertainty. Hope sat rigidly in a chair, her legal documents forgotten and abandoned in her bag as she waited with bated breath for news of her sister's condition. Suddenly, Thomas broke the tense silence, recalling a cherished memory from their past. "Remember when she was 5? That time she climbed the bookshelf trying to rescue her stuffed giraffe?" A faint smile tugged at the corners of Hope's lips as she replied, "You caught her just before she fell." Thomas's voice wavered with emotion as he continued. I've always tried to catch her. But maybe I missed things. The depression, the burnout at work. I should have seen it sooner. Hope turned to face him, her eyes fierce with determination. Dad, stop. You gave us everything. A home, love, stability. Things we might never have had otherwise. Faith is strong because you taught us both how to be strong. Hearing his daughter's unwavering faith in him, Thomas felt a surge of gratitude, even as his heart ached with the weight of his perceived failures. I just keep thinking about all those nights I worked late shifts, leaving you two with Mrs. Grayson. Hope squeezed his hand reassuringly. Those same late shifts that put us through college, that helped Faith become a nurse. You sacrificed everything for us, Dad. Faith knows that. She's always known that. The hours dragged on, punctuated only by the occasional sip of cold, forgotten coffee. Finally, the appearance of Dr. Matthews, still in her surgical scrubs, brought a glimmer of hope. We found the source of infection and managed to clear it, she explained. The surgery was successful, but Faith's recovery will be complicated. We're looking at several more weeks in the hospital minimum, with very close monitoring. Relief flooded Thomas's body, his knees weakening with the sudden release of tension. Hope pressed her hands to her face, her shoulders shaking with silent, cathartic sobs. Can we see her? Thomas asked, his voice tinged with a mixture of concern and anticipation. Once she's settled in recovery, but remember she's very weak. She needs absolute rest, the doctor cautioned. That night, as Thomas sat vigil in the dimly lit hospital room, watching Faith's steady breathing and the reassuring rhythm of the monitors, he felt a renewed sense of determination. Hope's quiet footsteps drew his attention, and he turned to see her enter the room, her face etched with exhaustion but her resolve unwavering. We can't stop now, she said firmly. For Faith and for all of us, we have to see this through. Thomas nodded, his own determination rekindled as he gazed upon his youngest daughter's sleeping form. The fight was far from over, but they would face it together, united in their love and commitment to each other. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and cameras as Thomas wheeled Faith carefully through the entrance, Hope walking beside them with her briefcase clutched tightly. Faith's face was still pale from her recent hospital stay, but determination burned in her eyes as they made their way to the courtroom. The flash of cameras and shouted questions followed them through the marble hallway. Inside, the wooden benches creaked under the weight of spectators. Camera flashes lit up the room despite the judge's restrictions, casting quick shadows across the ornate ceiling. Thomas helped Faith settle near the front, adjusting her blanket while Hope organized her documents at the counsel table, her fingers trembling slightly as she arranged the papers just so. When Hope stood to deliver her opening statement, her voice rang clear and strong through the hushed courtroom. 18 years ago, 2 newborn babies were abandoned in the bitter cold, left to die in a dumpster. Those babies were my sister and me. She paused, letting the words sink in, aware of every eye fixed upon her. Today, we're here to uncover why, and to hold accountable those who thought they could bury the truth forever. As Hope laid out their case, presenting document after document showing the pattern of deception, Thomas watched Faith's reactions carefully. Her hands trembled slightly in her lap, but she held her head high, especially when Hope detailed the falsified adoption records. The muscles in her jaw tightened with each new revelation. Caldwell's legal team launched their counterattack swiftly. These young women are attempting to exploit a tragic situation for financial gain, his lawyer declared, his voice dripping with manufactured sympathy, his expensive suit rustling as he gestured dramatically. Senator Caldwell is a respected public servant whose reputation is being unfairly tarnished. When Claire Morrison took the stand, her testimony cut through the defense's dismissive tone. She methodically presented her investigation's findings, bank records, witness statements, and a pattern of similar cover-ups spanning decades. The journalist's calm professionalism lent weight to every piece of evidence, her years of experience evident in her measured responses. The atmosphere grew tense as Caldwell himself approached the witness stand. His silver hair perfectly coiffed, he projected an image of grandfatherly concern, smoothing his tie as he sat down. "My heart goes out to these young ladies," he said smoothly, his practiced smile never reaching his eyes. But their pain has led them to construct a fantasy that simply isn't true. Hope's cross-examination was sharp and focused, but Caldwell deflected each question with practiced ease, weaving a narrative of persecution and false accusations. Several times, Thomas had to squeeze Faith's shoulder gently as she tensed in her wheelchair, clearly fighting back angry words. The muscles in her neck strained with the effort of staying silent. As the first day drew to a close, Hope sat at the counsel table surrounded by papers and notes. The weight of their task showed in the slight slump of her shoulders and the dark circles forming under her eyes. Thomas approached quietly, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. No words were needed. They both knew tomorrow would bring another battle in their fight for truth. The empty courtroom echoed with their unspoken determination. The second day of the trial dawned with tension thick in the air. The defense team wrapped up their case with an air of smug confidence, their closing argument painting Caldwell as a victim of baseless accusations. Hope stood slowly, her voice steady as she addressed the judge. "Your Honor, the prosecution calls Mr. James Franklin to the stand." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Caldwell's face tightened as the elderly lawyer made his way to the witness stand. His steps measured but determined. Mr. Franklin's hands trembled slightly as he was sworn in, but his voice was clear. "Mr. Franklin," Hope began, "could you please tell the court about your involvement with the adoption records of Hope and Faith Blake?" The retired lawyer cleared his throat. "I was the attorney who processed their adoption papers in 1987, but the documents submitted to the court were not the original ones." "Could you elaborate on that, please?" "I was approached by representatives of Senator Caldwell's family. They made it clear that certain modifications needed to be made to protect the senator's interests." Mr. Franklin's voice grew stronger as he continued. "They threatened my career, my family. I was told that if I didn't cooperate, I would never practice law again." The courtroom fell silent. Thomas reached for Faith's hand as they watched the testimony unfold. "What specific changes were you asked to make?" Hope pressed. "I was instructed to remove all references to the biological mother and her connection to the Caldwell family. They provided falsified documentation about the circumstances of abandonment." Mr. Franklin's shoulders sagged with the weight of his confession. "I've carried this guilt for decades." Caldwell's composed facade began to crack. His jaw clenched and his fingers drummed nervously on the table before him. Hope approached the jury, her voice filled with quiet intensity. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've heard today isn't just about two abandoned babies. It's about power used to silence the vulnerable. It's about money and influence being wielded as weapons to bury the truth." She gestured toward Faith in her wheelchair. "My sister and I survived that cold night in the dumpster, but how many others have been silenced? How many lives have been affected by those who believe they're above the law?" The jury members leaned forward, captivated by her words. "This case is bigger than my sister and me. It's about standing up to those who think their power puts them beyond accountability. It's about giving voice to every person who has been told their truth doesn't matter." As the judge called for adjournment, Caldwell stood abruptly, his face ashen. He strode from the courtroom, ignoring the barrage of questions from reporters. Hope gathered her papers, feeling the first real spark of optimism since the trial began. Mr. Franklin's testimony had changed everything. Thomas wheeled Faith toward the exit, and Hope fell into step beside them. The weight of the day's revelations hung in the air, but for the first time, it felt like justice might actually be possible. The courtroom buzzed with nervous energy as the jury filed in, their faces unreadable. Hope's fingers tightened around Thomas's hand, her knuckles white with tension. Faith sat beside them in her wheelchair, her face pale but determined. The judge's gavel crashed down, bringing immediate silence to the packed room. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked, his voice echoing off the wooden walls. The jury forewoman stood holding a piece of paper that seemed to carry the weight of their entire journey. "We have, Your Honor." "On the count of conspiracy to obstruct justice, how do you find?" "We find the defendant, Richard Caldwell, guilty." Hope's breath caught in her throat. Faith reached for her sister's free hand. "On the count of obstruction of justice?" "Guilty." On the count of defamation? Guilty. A wave of reaction swept through the courtroom. Some people cheered while others shouted in protest. The judge's gavel cracked again, restoring order. His Honor turned to Caldwell, who sat rigid in his chair. Mr. Caldwell, your actions represent a profound betrayal of public trust. You used your power and influence to harm innocent children and cover up your crimes. The court sentences you to the maximum penalty allowed by law. The judge's words carried a weight that seemed to crush Caldwell's carefully maintained facade. For the first time, the politician's shoulders slumped in defeat. Outside the courthouse, reporters and supporters crowded around the family. Microphones thrust forward as cameras flashed. Hope stepped up to speak, her voice clear and strong. Today, justice has been served not just for my sister and me, but for all those who have been silenced by power and privilege. We're grateful to everyone who stood by us and helped uncover the truth. Within hours, Caldwell's office released a statement announcing his immediate resignation. The formal apology followed, acknowledging the pain and suffering caused to the twins and other victims of his corruption. As they made their way through the crowd, Faith looked up at Thomas from her wheelchair. Her eyes shone with tears and pride. This victory isn't just for us, it's for you too. You've always been our hero. Thomas smiled down at his daughter, his heart too full for words. The three of them moved forward together, stronger than ever, their bond unbreakable in the face of truth and justice. The autumn sun cast a warm glow over the gathering crowd, as Hope and Faith stood beside Thomas at the construction site of their new foundation. Colorful balloons swayed in the gentle breeze, and rows of white chairs faced a small podium where 3 golden shovels waited. "I can't believe we're actually here," Faith whispered, her nurse's badge gleaming on her lapel. She'd made a full recovery, though she still walked with a slight limp, a reminder of how far they'd come. Hope squeezed her sister's hand. "Neither can I." She looked professional in her blazer, but her eyes sparkled with emotion as she surveyed the crowd of supporters. Thomas adjusted his tie, looking both proud and slightly uncomfortable with all the attention. "You girls did this," he said softly. "I'm just along for the ride." "Not true, Dad," Faith protested, linking her arm through his. The ceremony began with Hope stepping up to the podium. Her voice carried clearly across the crowd as she outlined their vision. The Blake Family Foundation will be more than just a building. It will be a sanctuary for children who feel lost and alone, just like Faith and I once were. Faith followed, describing the wellness programs she'd designed. Every child deserves not just physical care, but emotional support. Our medical clinic will provide both, ensuring no child falls through the cracks of our healthcare system. Hope then detailed the legal aid services they would offer. We'll have a team of dedicated attorneys providing free legal assistance to families in crisis. No parent should lose their children because they can't afford legal help. Thomas's part of the foundation touched many hearts, a mentorship program for potential foster and adoptive fathers. "Sometimes," he said, his voice steady but full of feeling, "all it takes is one person willing to step up and make a difference." The crowd applauded as the family took up the golden shovels. Together, they broke ground on what would become their legacy of hope. Later, as supporters mingled and celebrated, Faith and Hope guided Thomas to a covered easel near the podium. With gentle hands, they pulled away the cloth to reveal a bronze plaque. Thomas's eyes widened as he read the inscription, "Officer Thomas Blake, a true father and hero." "Dad," Hope said softly, watching tears fill his eyes. "You saved us twice," Faith added. "First from that dumpster and then by choosing to be our father." The crowd burst into applause, many wiping away tears of their own. Thomas stood there, overwhelmed by emotion, as his daughters wrapped their arms around him. The plaque would hang in the foundation's entrance, a testament to how one person's choice to care could change lives forever. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the construction site, the Blake family stood together, united in their mission to help others find the same love and hope they'd found in each other. The grand ballroom sparkled with elegant decorations as guests filtered in for the foundation's opening gala. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over tables adorned with white roses and silver ribbons. Thomas adjusted his tie nervously, standing near the entrance with Hope and Faith to greet their supporters. "Dad, relax," Hope said softly, smoothing his lapel. "Tonight's a celebration." Mrs. Grayson arrived first, now using a walker but still radiating the same warmth that had helped their family through those early years. "My darlings," she beamed, embracing each of them in turn. The room gradually filled with donors, community leaders, and families whose lives had already been touched by the Foundation's work. Children's artwork decorated one wall, showing bright crayon drawings of happy families and dreams for the future. When Faith took the podium, her voice carried clear and strong across the hushed room. "Many of you know our story," she began, her eyes finding Thomas in the crowd. "But what you might not know is that our greatest blessing wasn't just being rescued that cold winter night. It was being loved, truly and completely, by a man who chose to be our father." Hope joined her sister at the podium, adding, "Our foundation exists because one person decided to stop and listen for a cry in the darkness. Our father taught us that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change lives forever." 3 children from the Foundation's first summer program shared their stories next. 10-year-old Marcus described how the legal clinic had helped his grandmother gain custody of him. Sarah, a teenage girl, spoke about finding hope through the wellness programs Faith had designed. During a quiet moment between presentations, Thomas found himself in a corner with his daughters, away from the crowd. Faith adjusted the framed photo of their first day as a legal family that stood on display. "Remember how scared you were?" she asked, smiling at Thomas. "Terrified," he admitted, chuckling. "I had no idea what I was doing." "You did everything right," Hope assured him, linking her arm through his. The photographer caught them in that moment of shared laughter, their faces lit with joy and their bond evident in every relaxed line of their bodies. The camera then panned to capture the bronze plaque by the entrance, its words catching the light, "The Blake Family Foundation, where hope and faith build futures." The inscription below read, "In honor of Officer Thomas Blake, who showed us that family is built on love, not circumstance." If you enjoyed the story of Thomas, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.